So, welcome to the final module. We are going to be talking about finishes and of course finishing touches, because it's not just about the protective finishes at the end, but it's also about those extra details that are going to really elevate our piece of furniture. So, you might be wondering what I mean by finishes. Well, maybe you call it varnish or sealer. I refer to them as top coats sometimes. So it's all in the same family though. It's those things that you're going to apply right at the end of the project, which are going to help your designs and your refinished furniture look good for a long time. Now, they're not all created equal, so I will go into some details and try and make it sort of as simple as possible to understand the difference. There is a massive area, but I will show you some of the products I use and the ones I'm going to use on this particular project and help you to make a decision about the one that you want to use for your project. So as I've said, there's different names for finishes, no matter what you call it, but there are also different types of finishes within that as well. So you might be aware of oils, waxes, and varnish is another one, but varnish is actually a specific type of top coat, but it's become a catch-all term for something that we apply to protect a surface. You may be also aware of polyurethane as a name, or polyacrylic is another one, and they tend to be sort of water-based finishes, whereas a varnish is an oil-based finish. So as I go through, I'll sort of talk about the difference between that, and it's sort of sometimes a choice of what is going to be the best for your project. Sometimes also it might be what's best for you to work with, because it's much easier to work with water-based products, it's much easier to wash up water-based products, and you might also be somebody that finds it better for your health to work with water-based products. So these are choices you make as you go through. Another choice you've got to think about is what you want your finish to look like. They also have different sheen levels, so you might be aware of things such as gloss, satin, matte. So we have to sort of consider how much sort of reflectiveness do I want my project to have. So that's another thing to sort of throw into the mix of deciding what finish you want to use. Now, it's worth saying that not all your projects need a finish, especially now when we're using these really high-tech, durable furniture paints. A lot of them have got what they call an inbuilt top coat, or they're self-sealing, so you don't need to put a top coat on if that project is going to be somewhere that it's not going to get a lot of wear and tear. So what they call a high traffic area. So it might be something that people are going to touch a lot, might get kicked or scuffed. If it's something that's sort of out of the way, I like to think of it as like, a side table with a lamp on it. You could just paint that and you don't need to worry about it having to hold up to lots of wear and tear. That's when you might be starting to think about a protective finish. The other type of paint might be eggshell. Now, eggshell itself also has quite a tough finish, and you might not need to necessarily put a top coat over it as well. So if you get to the end of your project and you like the look of it and you think, I'm quite happy with that, it doesn't need to take a lot of extra wear and tear, then you could decide to leave it there. Now, I would say if you were creating pieces for sale, it's certainly worth, unless you're using an eggshell, which has that sort of really inbuilt robustness. If you're using any other kind of paint, like I've been using fusion mineral paint, I would certainly suggest you use a top coat on those high traffic areas. So, for example, the fronts of drawers, where people are going to be touching it a lot, pushing their nails against a handle, for example, it's just going to, over time, start to degrade that finish. The fronts of doors, and especially the tops of units. Now, this one might be just left with some ornaments on top, and so it's not such a big deal. But the tabletops, sideboard tops, things where people are going to be putting things down and picking things up, I think need some extra protection. Another example is kitchens. So they're going to need a lot of extra protection to help them to last and stay looking good long term. So there are two reasons that we use finishes on our projects. The first is to protect. So we might want to sort of extend that life, as we say about the paint, making sure that it lasts longer, stays looking its best longer. But also we want to protect our bare wood surfaces. So here this is basically raw wood, and so that needs something over the top of it to protect that wood from spills and splashes and wear and tear as well. Also to enhance, so that's the second reason. And in this case, I've got, for example, Fusion Mineral Paint Coal Black down here, which has got quite a matte finish. And darker colours, particularly in matte finish paints, they can look a bit dusty over time. They can pick up just, what they can mar, basically. It'll wipe off with a cloth, but the nice thing about using a top coat over a matte finish like that is it intensifies the colour and it stops it picking up dusty marks easily. So that's something to consider if you wanted to sort of avoid that. It also, of course, enhances wood. So that's another big reason we'd use a finish over wood. Not just to protect it, to seal the surface, to stop things penetrating. You know, so if something was splashing on this, it would obviously stain it, but also to enhance it. So our finish can absorb into the wood and bring out the qualities of the wood and really bring it to life, as they say, make the grain pop. So we'll be looking at the different products and what is best for doing that. And there is also within the enhancing your project, the decorative finishes. So whether you might use a metallic or glittery or any kind of sort of finish on top like a wax, just to accentuate your project. Another way you can enhance your projects using finishes is decoratively, basically. So you might add a metallic wax to highlight some details. You might add a dark glaze to bring out details and to sort of put a depth into a paint finish. They're not going to protect the finish, but they're not going to protect your project, sorry, but they are going to add a sort of an extra dimension on top. So I'm just going to go through some of the options out there. It's a huge subject, and I'm never stopped learning about top coats. I'm always testing them out. I'm a big believer in getting a sample board, trying it with your paint, seeing if you like the finish, you know, if it's too matte, if it's too satin, what have you. So play around with these things and try new products, you know, as they come along. Use sample boards. But what I'm going to do, you know, to get you started is to go through some of my favourite products and to hopefully simplify the area a little bit in terms of deciding what's best for your project. One thing it's key to say, though, at this point is that if your prep isn't right and if your paint isn't sticking, no top coat is going to sort that out. Your foundations have got to be right. So very often people do say, if I put a top coat over it, will it stop it scratching or chipping? If it's already doing those things, if it's already unsound, your top coat isn't going to rectify that, unfortunately. So you do actually need to go back a few steps, sort that out before you put your top coat on. So let's talk about the different products that are out there so you can make your own decision about what you use in your projects. Now, as I mentioned before, they're not all created equal. They have different abilities in terms of how they protect, how long they last, and what they actually do to create that kind of finish. So I was saying before about enhancing. Some will enhance woods more than others. So you've got to take that into account when you're choosing. So I've gathered together some of the products that I use, just as we talk through the different sort of options you've got. What you won't see here is any wax. I don't use wax at all in any of my projects, not even to highlight details, simply because you cannot paint over wax. Once wax is on, you need to remove it fully with white spirit before you can do painting again. So if I was to highlight some details and it didn't quite look right, I'd have to use white spirit to take that back, which is possibly going to affect the paint underneath. So I find the best way to work is to consistently work with a water-based finish. So I'm going to highlight something, I'll use a sort of a water-based metallic paint instead of using a wax. Also, it's really important to say at this point that wax isn't totally protective as a finish either. So it does add a sort of a subtle sheen to paint, and that's why it's really popular with chalk paint to seal it. But it's not a durable finish. It will mark over time, it's not water resistant, and it will dull, and it will need topping up. So think about that in terms of a project piece for a client. You do all that work, you make it look beautiful, but in a couple of years' time, that wax starts to change and it needs topping up and it needs buffing again. It's not really something that I want to be saying to my customers. You need to look after that. So for me, and the fact that I can't change my mind, and future generations of furniture upcyclers can't come along and easily change the project when they come to refinish one of my pieces because of that wax. I don't use wax. Similarly, oils like hemp, and I've got orange oil here. These are natural oils. They don't really provide a very protective finish at all either. So I wouldn't use something like this or hemp oil on the front surfaces of my furniture. Now, while an oil gives you a really nice rich look, something like this that hasn't been processed other than to be, you know, created from the oranges, but it hasn't got any dryers in it, hasn't been chemically processed to create a harder finish. Something like this is going to oxidize over time and it's going to dry out effectively the surface, and you're going to end up needing to reapply it much quicker with this, like a Danish oil, a tongue oil, or let me think of the other one, boiled linseed oil. They're all more processed oils than this sort of natural oil, and they will last longer, and you can get a harder finish from them, which is why they're a little bit harder to apply than these. I'll show you how to apply this shortly, but it is really as simple as just wiping it on and leaving it. A more processed oil, like a boiled linseed oil or a tongue oil, a Danish oil, you can't leave it. You have to wipe it back, and you have to be careful to build it up slowly, otherwise it will go sticky. The idea is these absorb into the surface and they don't leave a residue on the surface. So that's why they're not so protective, and that's why in time you're going to have to top them up. So I would just use something like this or a hemp oil inside my furniture to refresh it and to make it look nice and clean and ready to go, so it can put the sort of life back into the internal wood. So I would use it inside my drawers and sometimes underneath if it needs it as well. So what do we use if oils and waxes aren't really going to cut it in terms of being hard wearing and durable for our furniture? So I would say most of the time we're going to turn to polyurethane. So polyurethane is a water-based finish. I call them top coats. It's basically a water-based version of varnish. Varnish being an older product, oil-based, and you'll know varnish because it gives that sort of amber glow. It's kind of a really warm yellowish product. These are perfectly clear. So the great thing about polyurethane is that you can go over whites and light colours, and you don't have to worry about any slight tinting, so as we say, ambering, that you would get from an older oil-based product. So my particular brand that I love is General Finishes because it's so easy to work with. It dries really quickly, it's really forgiving. I mean, like with any top coat, you have to be really careful of drips. You need to kind of be quite vigilant when you're working, and I'll show you sort of as I'm going through myself how I sort of do that. It happens, that we might miss the odd one, but these are really forgiving to use, and I find they don't create very many brush strokes. I'm also going to show you some of the ways that I apply those products to make it easy for you. Now, what's really popular with furniture upcyclers, especially when we're trying to bring out the best of the wood grain, is Osmo Pollux oil. Now, this is an oil-based product, so it will amber. However, having said that, Osmo do a version of this product called Osmo Pollux Oil Raw, which has an amount of white pigment in it, which will keep your piece sort of slightly subdued in colour. So if you were, one example is you've got a very pale wood and you don't want it to go darker when you top coat it. You would go for a Pollux Oil Raw, and that will just keep that colour exactly the same. Most top coats, most finishes are going to slightly darken your wood, and also probably your paint a little bit. It'll just intensify it is the way I like to describe it. So that's why I sort of advocate the white spirit trick for wood, because that shows you that depth of colour that you're going to get when you've added your finish to it. Now, the advantage of something like Osmo Pollux oil is because it is an oil-based product, it will absorb deeper into your wood, and it will create much more drama from the grain. This is Fusion Stain and Finishing Oil, which is a very similar sort of product to this. This also comes in a tinted variety, so if you're looking to put a bit of colour in as well, Stain and Finishing Oil has 6 different tints, I think. And you can also get Osmo in tints as well, so that's something to sort of think about. It's actually developed for floors, and so it's incredibly tough, but the whole premise is it absorbs into the wood, and it forms a barrier that can stop water, it can repel water, but it doesn't create a sort of really thick film across the top. So if you wanted a very smooth surface across your design, across everything, you'd want to go for something like a polyurethane, because polyurethane doesn't absorb in the same way. It sits on top and it creates a film, it creates a barrier, and after sort of 3 to 4 coats potentially, you can start to get a really nice smooth layer. So really nice for tabletops, so that everything's sort of locked in together, whereas the Pollux oil works in a slightly different way. So actually on my projects, I sometimes use a mix of both. So I might use the Osmo oil over the wood areas where I've just got a small amount of painted design. Where I want to protect my paint, I would use the polyurethane because that's designed for overpaint and this is designed for over wood. If you just want one product, I'd say the polyurethane will do both. So I'll just talk you through those as I go through my project, and you'll see the actual application and where I'm actually using the product so you can see the difference. Let's just talk in a little bit more detail though about the different looks of finish. I mentioned before, touched upon gloss, satin, matte, the different styles, which you may have heard of some of those before, and how they work. Now, this is something to be really aware of when we come to use our products, because it can affect how tough they are. So in a sort of sliding scale, your gloss finish is your toughest of all. It's the purest, it's the hardest. Now, as we go sort of through the scale, your next most hard-wearing, toughest finish is satin. So satin has had some mattifying particles added to it, which sort of stop the light reflecting, so it's not as glossy as gloss. So it will have started off as gloss, and it just gets knocked down a little bit in its sheen level to become a satin. So satin is effectively halfway between gloss and matte. That's the idea. So you've got this sliding scale, and satin's really hard wearing, and that's kind of where I go. I don't really want totally glossy, but I do want some sheen, so I go satin. Then when you move sort of down the scale, you get to your matte finishes, and further down again, your flat or dead flat or flat out flat, you might have heard of. Those are where they are super matte. So your matte sheen is going to be maybe 5%. It will still catch the light a little bit, but it's going to stop a lot of light reflecting. So the quantity of mattifying particles they put in there, literally floating around in the top coat, will go up, it will increase, and that makes that finish not quite as hard wearing as a satin, not quite as tough as a satin. So you've got that sliding scale. Then when you get down to dead flat, or flat out flat, as some brands call it, that's got a lot of mattifying particles in, and that is going to reflect most of the light. Dead flat, so no reflection at all. And it gives a little bit like a waxed finish. It's really, really soft and subtle. And those actually can be a little too soft on their own. So the best advice, especially if you're doing something commercially, is to put a satin top coat first and then finish it up with matte. And that will give you the best of both worlds. So you'll have that protection layer, and then you can have the look layer that sort of bounces the light off the top. So just something to bear in mind. Also, as we're going through, I'm going to sort of apply some of each product to a sample board and just show you how that catches the light. And you'll see the difference between over paint, over wood, but also over metallics. So it's something to bear in mind when it comes to these matte products. They will reflect the light, bounce the light back from a metallic product. So if you're working with metallics a lot like I do, that's why you've probably very rarely seen me use matte, because it's going to dull the shine and the reflectiveness off my metallics. So I don't tend to use it very much. Or if I do, I might use it in other areas away from the metallic paint itself. So I'm just going to do a little side-by-side comparison so you can actually see the difference in the finishes, how to apply them, and what they look like. So I've split my board up into 6. I've got wood at this end, white paint, black paint, and gold paint. So we can see what they look like across the different types of finish. So on this far side, I'm starting with a flat out flat, or a dead flat, as it might be in a different range, which is the mattest finish. And then I've got matte, or in this range it's called flat. So that's your standard sort of flat finish. Then I've got the satin that I was using on my piece, and then a satin in the Enduro VAR, which is the one that is meant to emulate the old-fashioned varnish look, but is water-based. So it's not going to be smelly, and it's not sort of sticky and difficult to wash up. Here's the Pollux oil, and this one's the satin. And then I've got a natural oil, like a hemp oil or an orange oil, just to show you what that does and how to apply it as well. So let's start. Let's just move these down. We'll start with the flat out flat. Now what you've got to be really wary of with any product, and it's really easy because these are in a tin, some of these products come in bottles, is to stir them really well. So you can see that this product, if I get hold of it, has actually got sort of sediment in the bottom, which will clump together, and you've got to really distribute that and mix that evenly through before you start. Those are the mattifying particles. That is what makes it matte. If you leave the sediment completely alone, you're going to end up with a much shinier top coat because they're not going to reflect the light because they're all at the bottom of the pot. You might get a streaky finish as a result. So make sure you stir well. And then when that's done, I'm just going to pour a little bit into a container. You'll see it's a lot more opaque than the previous top coat that I was using. And then for the purpose of this, I'm just going to use a Gen Poly brush to apply it. Here. And you should see that it goes on a lot milkier because of those mattifying particles than the satin. And you might even see sort of that it's a bit streaky. And it is a common thing with matte and dead flat top coats that they can be a bit streaky over dark colours. I don't know if you can see there. Simply because those mattifying particles are really hard to distribute evenly when you're applying it, especially with you know, a brush or a foam brush like this. So what I tend to do, only for matte top coats, to avoid that streakiness of distribution, is I would go ahead and use the roller and laying off method just to smooth those so you get an even distribution. So roller on your matte top coats and smooth through it afterwards with your laying off brush. And that gives you the best, smoothest result. For other top coats, it isn't necessary to go to that extent to get a roller all covered in top coat. I'd just go ahead and apply it straight because you don't have to worry about that streakiness, anything from a satin upwards. So let's get the flat. So this is going to have a bit more sheen to it than the flat out flat or dead flat. Let's find the can opener. There we go. But I still need to stir it because there will be sediment at the bottom that needs to be mixed in. So put some of that out. Just doing it gently, I don't want to stir up loads of air or bubbles. And then, again, looks great over most things, but you can see that really showing up white over the black. So it's really interesting to see the different effects. When this is dry, I'll hold it up so it can catch the light, and you can see the difference between the way that it works over the different surfaces there. Okay. Then next onto the satin, which we've seen in the demonstration on my piece. So I can just use the applicator because I've got it to hand. So in, lightly back, and then nice and smooth across. So you can see really clear, no yellowing, leaving the white perfectly white, the translucent finish. Moving on to the Enduro Var. It's gone. So another one of these hybrid products, like Pollock's oil, that have been created to mimic products, older products, but with enhanced qualities, basically. just going to stick that in there because I haven't got a container to decant it into, which isn't great, but you'll see that's a much more amber coloured product because it's trying to mimic the old-fashioned varnish. And so again, like Pollux oil, I wouldn't use this over white unless you really do want that warm colour. You do want things not to be as clear as the other products that we were using just there. So this also has a heavier consistency like the Pollux oil, so I definitely try to use this on a flat surface if I can, because it can sag like varnish, so you just want to kind of make sure you don't put too much on, and then you keep an eye on it. And then the Pollux oil, which we've seen before, similar kind of colour and a heavy consistency. And these heavier products, they can be so forgiving in terms of brush strokes because they have the weight to flow and to not sit and show brush marks. So okay. And then finally, I'm going to use just a natural oil. So this is an unprocessed oil. I've got orange oil. It could be hemp oil, which is another popular one. This one's just got a lovely scent to it, so it's great for doing the interior of your drawers and etc. when you're finished. I'm going to use, just missed a spot there, I can see. I'm going to use a lint-free cloth. So literally when you rub it, no fibres come off. So it might be that you've got some old fabric, some old rags or something at home that is like that you can just cut up into squares and use, or you can buy lint-free cloths. They often just cut these in half to use. And you must be really careful when you use oils with rags that you wet them before you throw them away because they are combustible. So make sure not to throw away oily rags just like this. And then, just make sure I've got enough because I'm going to move it out of the way. I'll just apply that like I'm wiping a surface. And you may get a little tinge over the white with these oil-based products, but nothing drastic. And then I'll just add that to there. It smells lovely. Great for deodorising as well if the wood's a bit foisty. So there you go. Now the thing about that is it's not going to absorb into the paint, just like the Pollux oil won't absorb into the paint, like it's meant to absorb into the wood. Oil-based products absorb in. It's not going to absorb in, so I want to make sure, because this doesn't have any dryers in it or any chemical sort of processing, that's just going to stay wet on top of there. So what I do is actually over the paint, it's not adding any protection, it's not going to go anywhere, I just wipe away the excess. And it just adds a little tiny sheen to it. However, it's not making Fusion any more robust for doing that really. But it does add a really nice tone to the wood. So we'll come back and have a look at these and compare the difference between the effects when that's dry. So let's look at the sample board in a bit more detail. These are the more matte top coats, so that's over wood. And see there's very little sheen there. Then over the white paint, you can see that it's really clear. A little bit of sheen on the nearer one, which is the matte, not the flat out flat. You can see it much more clearly over the black, that there is a bit more sheen on the black, where we've used the flat matte top coat, not the flat out flat, which is the second one furthest away. And then when we come down to the metallic, again, you can see that the light's reflecting off the matte, but not the dead flat or flat out flat, which is the furthest away. So then onto the satin top coats. You can see there's a bit more colour in the wood. You can also see more sheen quite clearly. The one furthest away is the General Finishes High Performance, so that's the clear. And then you'll see closer to the camera, the amber colour over the white is the Endurovar, which is the one that mimics the old-fashioned varnish, so it's actually put a colour, a tint over that white. So something to be aware of using oil-based finishes. And then as I come down to the black, you'll see they're both sort of equally sheeny. And then as you come onto the metallics, similarly, you're getting quite a nice sheen across them from both of those. Then let's have a look at the oils. So that's the Pollux oil on the left and the orange oil on the right. And you can see they're much more intensified wood grain on those than there is on the top coats. Now these still look great, but there's just a bit more depth of colour here. That's where the oils are penetrated into the wood. But you'll also see with the Pollux oil that there is a little bit of ambering over the white. Coming down to the black, the sheen level's really similar across all the satins actually, and there doesn't look too much difference between those. And again, it works really well over metallic, it's not dulling down the shine. And then when we come onto the orange oil, or what would be hemp oil, you'll see that that's really intensified the wood, but it hasn't added any sheen at all. So it's actually really matte. Over the paint, little tiny bit. But again, we were saying there's no protectiveness there, it's just merely an appearance. And then actually, I can see here, I've forgotten to wipe it back, and what you'll see over the metallic is that doesn't ever dry up, it'll just sit there. So it has to be wiped back over paint. It's not providing any protective layer, but it is providing a really nice nourished look to the wood.